In this next video, we're going to talk about the actual fighting of the First World War. And we're going to start in the summer of 1914 with just a brief mention of the popularity of the war when it came around. When the war broke out in the summer of 1914, it was almost universally welcomed. Austrian statesmen felt that they could solve their nationality's problem by defeating the upstart Serbia. France felt that they could reverse the dishonor of the loss to Prussia in 1871 and recover Alsace and Lorraine. The Germans could solve the Austrians' problem and grow even greater in that relationship, and also stop Russian growth. The Russians would be able to assert themselves in the Balkan Peninsula and gain that warm water port that they had long looked for. The British could stop the growth of German naval power. So everybody's looking forward to this war, and populations are supporting it as well. You see in this picture, as German soldiers are marching through town, they are being warmly greeted, and they look quite comfortable about where they're headed. We've got another photo here of some British soldiers heading off to war. Everybody excited with the idea that this war would be like other wars fought in recent decades, very quick and decisive, and these men felt that they would be home by Christmas time. They would, of course, be wrong. The war begins in the summer of 1914 with the beginning of the German Schlieffen Plan. And recall that the Schlieffen Plan was Germany's wartime plan to avoid fighting that two-front war by defeating France. This was all based on calculating the timetables that it would take for Russia to mobilize their armies and for Germany to move their armies after a defeat of France across the German nation to fight the now invading Russians. This all came within 6 weeks. The French, according to the Schlieffen Plan, needed to be defeated within 6 weeks, 42 days, and that was the time that it would take the Russians to ultimately mobilize. And then, following the defeat of France, Germany could rush across Germany, across their nation, and meet the advancing Russians and defeat them, and then the war could be over by Christmas. This obviously does not work out the way it was intended. First of all, the Schlieffen Plan called for an invasion of France through neutral Belgium, through the relatively flat lands of neutral Belgium. Germany had hoped that the Belgians would just open the door and let them walk right through their nation, but this certainly did not happen. The Belgians put up a unexpectedly strong resistance, particularly at a fortress known as Liege, here is where we first want to note the strength of defensive weaponry in 1914. New military technologies have been on the rise that have supported offensive and defensive militaries, but it's certainly, at this point in military history, the defensive weaponry is far superior, and that can be seen as heavy artillery, or in particular the machine gun. The Belgians have both of those, and that's going to allow them to at least slow down the Germans, which puts that Schlieffen Plan 42 days in question. Adding to the German troubles at the outset of the war, the Russians are going to mobilize far faster than the Germans had ever given them credit to be able to do. So Russian mobilization comes faster, and they begin to, almost immediately upon the beginning of the war, push troops across the border into East Prussia, which is the eastern portion of Germany, and begin a war on the Eastern Front before the Germans were even close to coming to defeating France. Germany is forced to prematurely move troops across to the Eastern Front to defend those eastern borders. Railroads that are good for concentrating forces in the war, but as troops are marching into the battle, and this is what Germany is going to be experiencing on the Western Front as they do make their way through Belgium and into France, as the armies are marching into battle, they begin to become further and further from their supply lines, and that makes feeding these massive armies more difficult. And then, as I've already mentioned, there's little accounting for modern defensive technologies like machine guns and artillery, and even modern aircraft that are being used as reconnaissance to see enemy troop movements. So ultimately, the Schlieffen Plan was a failure. The German army fails to sweep around Paris, as was the hope, to cut Paris off from any outside support. That ultimately failed. The Germans failed to encircle Paris. Now, at the same time, the French were launching their own wartime plans, that Plan 17, which was a frontal assault into Germany to retake Alsace and Lorraine. That failed as well. The French attack into Alsace and Lorraine failed, again for many of the same reasons, no accounting for the strength of these new defensive technologies. The main German army, very early in the war, will present its flank to the French, and the French will stage a counterattack at what is known as the Battle of the Marne. The French will stage a counterattack in September of 1914 at the Battle of the Marne. This is from September 5th to September 12th, where the French are able to flank the incoming Germans, who never followed through with the goal of the Schlieffen Plan, which stated that the westernmost soldier, and let me show you here on the map here, that these northernmost soldiers invading from the Germans were to be dipping their right shoulders into the sea here to avoid being outflanked. Well, that never happened due to the difficulties that the Germans had getting through Belgium and into northern France. So at the Battle of the Marne, French troops are able to stop this German advance and begin to push them back. Following the Battle of the Marne, we have what's known as the Race to the Sea in September and October of 1914, where subsequent attacks and counterattacks by each army hoping to outflank their enemy ultimately results in a stalemate up to the North Sea, where each army begins to dig in, and shortly following, a line of trenches that will eventually stretch hundreds of miles, I should say, from the North Sea all the way down into Switzerland will be developed. This is what is known as the Western Front. We can see that back here a little bit more clearly. This is what is known as the Western Front. And this is where the vast majority of the fighting and the dying in the First World War will take place along that Western Front. From here, we've got stalemated war. This Western Front war is known as a war of attrition, where each side is going to try to wear down their enemy by exhausting its supply of men and guns and ammunition. This is where the First World War becomes a total war, where the total mobilization of all of the resources of these societies fighting the war will be used in order to find victory. The French war effort is ultimately going to be undermined by the loss of their industrial territories in the northern part of the country, as that's falling right in the heart of the war. France has got to depend on supplies coming from outside, like Britain and the United States. The British establish a naval blockade. We'll talk more about this in a later video, but the British will establish a naval blockade, virtually locking Germany off from any outside assistance, whether it comes from a neutral United States in the early years of the war or any German colonies. The nation of Germany will be totally left on its own without any outside assistance throughout the course of the war. New weapons were developed in the early years of the war in an attempt to break the stalemate. We've already mentioned the machine guns in existence, but here, take a look at this horrible picture of troops crossing in no man's land with their gas masks on, and this poor fellow without his. In April of 1915, Germans would use poison gas for the first time at the Battle of Ypres in Belgium. Now, this had limited value overall, as changing winds could have blown the gas right back over your own lines, and shortly following the beginning of the use of poison gas in war, gas masks would be developed that could neutralize that threat. But it still brought great death and destruction and a new aspect of terror to the Western Front. Each side would resort to attacks using greater resources and manpower to overcome the defense by the sheer weight of their numbers. So if these defensive technologies were so great, the belligerents thought that just throwing more men into the fray would ultimately break the back of the enemy. Two battles on the Western Front of note. First, at the Battle of Verdun, almost 1 million casualties and over 300,000 dead. Later at the Battle of the Somme, over 1 million casualties on both sides. So these are just two quick battles to highlight the total war aspect of the First World War. And I would encourage you all to look a little bit more into those battles specifically. By 1918, We've got some changes in the war on the Western Front. We've got American troops beginning to arrive, and we will talk more about the United States entering the First World War in a later video. And that is going to lead some fresh soldiers and fresh supplies, aiding the British and the French on the Western Front. And finally, by the spring of 1918, the Germans will throw their last-ditch assault into the Western Front, into those lines of trenches on the Western Front, known as the Spring Offensive. This ultimately fails. By the end of September, German forces are being pushed back, and the front begins to slowly move back to the east towards Germany. Other fronts of the war. On the Eastern Front, we've got a very different war happening. Fighting on the east was far more mobile than it was on the Western Front, with large areas of territory exchanging hands. And we can see here the border between Russia and Germany and Russia and Austria. And then this red dotted line represents the tremendous distance that Russian armies will be pushed back following their defeats early in the war. Two battles to note that you should be familiar with is the Battle of Tannenberg, where the Russian Second Army will be destroyed early in the fighting in 1914, where almost 80,000 will be killed or wounded, and nearly 100,000 troops will be taken prisoner by the Germans. It's an absolute disaster for the Russian army. And shortly after, at the Battle of Masarian Lakes, again, German mobility is going to aid in defeating the Russians, despite the fact that the Russians actually outnumbered them. These two devastating defeats for the Russians will signal a coming backtracking of the Russian army and ultimately a defeat of the Russians. Now, the Russians would find themselves more successful against the Austrians in the south, but ultimately their defeats to the Germans in these northern battles were just too devastating. With the Russian Revolution that's going to come in February and March of 1917, there's a great debate in Russia as to whether or not to continue the war. The provisional government under Alexander Kerensky stays in the war with hopes that the war can be won and that Russia will not have to give up territory following a defeat, so they stay in the war. But a second revolution, what's known as the Bolshevik Revolution in October of 1917, the Russians will ultimately back out of the war, or at least begin talks to back out of the war. German forces then could leave the Eastern Front and return to the West and support their armies in the West, while Russia will sign a horribly unequal treaty known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which requires Russia to give up vast tracts of territory to the victorious Germans and Ottomans and Austrians, obviously. This Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, we will bring it up again when we discuss the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the war, but it's important to remember how punishing this treaty was to the Russians just before we start to feel too sympathetic towards the Germans about the Treaty of Versailles. Basically, anybody that was going to lose this war was going to have a punishing treaty dealt to them. A couple other fronts of note. We're going to talk about the Italian front in the south, where the Italians will do battle against the Austrians. The Italians, of course, were originally a part of what was known as the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. That was a defensive alliance, but as this war started as an offensive war, with Austria attacking Serbia and Germany invading into Belgium to get to France, Italy was not compelled by their treaty of alliance to join into that fight. So very early in the war, by May of 1915, the Italians will join on the Allied side of the war, hoping to gain some territory from Austria-Hungary and unite all Italian-speaking peoples that lived within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By the time the war comes to an end in 1918, with Austria-Hungary being defeated, the Italians had lost 1 million men and only gained roughly about 12 miles of territory, so horrible costs with very little gain. We have another front with the Ottoman Empire, and you can see the Ottoman Empire is in a horrible geographic position, being wedged between Russia to their north, and then you've got British holdings in Egypt to their south, and so the Ottoman Empire is going to become central to this warfare. In October of 1914, Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, enters the war on the side of the Central Powers. This is largely based on a previous economic relationship with Germany and belief that Germany was actually going to win the fight. Of important note in this Ottoman campaign is what's known as the Gallipoli Campaign. The Gallipoli Campaign was an attempt by the British to secure the straits leading from ultimately the Mediterranean Sea into the Black Sea, where if they could gain the opening of those straits from the Ottoman, they could better supply the Russians to continue fighting the war in the East. This failed Battle of Gallipoli from April of 1915 to January of 1916 was horribly costly for the British and ultimately a defeat where over 400,000 were dead with over a 50% casualty rate. The Ottomans were also fighting in the Middle East as the British wanted to, one, help defeat the Ottomans, but two, gain future rights to easier access to their colonies in South Asia like India. So in the Middle Eastern campaign, Britain is going to focus on the defense of the Suez Canal and try to ultimately gain those land rights across Mesopotamia. In 1915, Britain is going to make a promise to support Arabs that would revolt against the Ottoman Empire and support that with ultimately a promise of an Arab kingdom in the region. This is known as the Arab Revolt, and the Arabs certainly do rise up against the Ottoman Empire and support the British and their war aims. The British also make secret agreements with France to divide the Middle East between them following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. And finally, what we've already talked about with our Arab-Israeli conflict discussion, the British also make what's known as the Balfour Declaration, that promises British support for the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine following the war. Now, Britain made these simultaneous promises because their number one goal at the time was to defeat the Ottoman Empire and also to look out for British self-interest in the years after the war. So British armies, along with the Arab Revolt, ultimately proved successful, and the Ottomans were defeated by October of 1918. One important thing to note on the Ottoman front is the Armenian Genocide. World War I offered an opportunity for the new Ottoman government to eliminate a population of Armenian Christians in the eastern portion of their empire, who were seen as a threat to the Ottomans. The Armenian Genocide resulted in adult populations of Armenians being arrested and massacred or driven out of their homes on a forced march to Syria, and upwards of 1.5 million Armenians would perish in what is labeled by some the first genocide of the 20th century. Now, this is truly a world war. We have a couple other fronts where belligerents will be meeting. First, in the former German colonies of Africa, or the current German colonies of Africa, I should say. The British and French colonial troops will be waging war to conquer those lands from Germany. And finally, the Japanese, a rising power. The Japanese will move to take over all of Germany's rights in China and in the Pacific. So there you have it, war, a truly world war fought on many fronts with some different characteristics on each front. You should especially pay attention to the differences on the eastern and the western fronts in the war. Stay tuned, and for our next video, we will give a little bit more depth into the American involvement in the First World War. Thanks for watching.